All right, thank you so much, guys, for coming. Today we're doing lecture 18, and we're going to talk about the brain structure, and we're going to split it into smaller structures and talk about their functions. All right. It so turns out that in the modules, I think one of the problems was matching the brain structures with their function. So we'll kind of try to really go through that in this as we go through that. So the brain really is you know, we've talked about it when we do homeostasis. We talked about it being the control center. Okay, the brain has all the set points for all the variables in the body that maintain normal physiology. Okay, and therefore any input that goes to the brain that is deviant from the set point is then corrected by directions from the brain. So we know about this already from our homeostasis, which we did at the beginning, that the brain is the master control center, right? And that, of course, it's in the cranium, which is the skull. Okay, and it is 4 major parts. And then today, what we'll do is we'll break each part into smaller pieces and then talk about the functions of each. Okay, so pretty much I look at the brain as an ice cream cone. Okay. Seriously, it really looks like one. If you look at it, you have the medulla, which kind of tapers into the spinal cord, and then you have the pons. Okay, this is the brainstem. So the brainstem is the cone, and the cerebrum and the cerebellum will be the ice cream, right? Okay, isn't that nice? And then so you have boom, 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 and then you have your thing in the back there. Okay, so this is this cerebrum, okay, which has got 2 hemispheres, the left and the right, and we'll talk about the functions of that. And the cerebrum is split into lobes, which are named after the bone under which it occurs. Like the parietal lobe is under the parietal bone, which we did in the skeletal system. The frontal lobe is under the frontal bone, which we did. We know about that. Okay, so it's split into those 5 lobes, and we'll talk about the functions of each of those lobes. Okay. And then somewhere in the middle here would be what's called the Diencephalon. The Diencephalon is made up of mainly the thalamus, and we'll talk about it in the hypothalamus. Okay, the thalamus, all the sensory information to the brain goes through the thalamus. Okay, except the sense of smell. Okay, and we'll talk about that. And then of course the hypothalamus. We did talk a lot about it when we did the endocrine system. We talked about how those hypothalamic hormones get to control the secretions in the pituitary. We did talk about that. So you already know some of the functions of the hypothalamus, and we'll talk about that. And it's part of the diencephalon. Okay, it's right in the middle. The cerebellum literally means small brain, because the cerebellum is set up pretty much like the cerebrum, with the cerebellar hemispheres split by what is called the vermis, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. This has got the hemispheres, hemi half, and the vermis, which connects the two. And then the brainstem is the smaller part, the cone, okay? But the cone is made up of the medulla oblongata, right? And the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. So it tapers, and the way it starts, this is the spine, okay, the spinal cord, okay? And the medulla has got several very important functions. And then what else is part of the brainstem? This is the pons. You see this bulging thing? Pons means bridge in Latin. So it's pretty much a bridge of information from the lower parts of the brain, the CNS, okay, and the upper parts. So it's like a conduit of information, and it sends it up like a bridge, just like you cross a bridge. Okay, so the pons is a bridge, and then of course this is the midbrain. Okay, which is very close to the diencephalon. All right, midbrain, and we'll talk about the functions of each of these parts, the functions of each of the cerebellum parts, and the functions of the diencephalon in each of those parts, and then we'll finish off with the cerebrum. Okay, so sounds like a deal. Good. So, boom, there is the ice cream cone made up of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay? And then the cerebrum, which is this made up of the frontal cortex, the parietal, the occipital, and then, of course, the temporal on the side. Okay? And this is a dissection, a cross-section through the brain. And we will do this, the first level in P2 will dissect through the brain, the eye, and the heart. And then we'll have just this very much cross-section. So you see this thick white part, it's full of nerve tracts. It's called the corpus callosum, and it's what connects the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. Okay? And you have 300 million axons crossing from one side of the brain to the other through the corpus callosum. Okay? And that's what it does. And there are other connectors like the anterior commissure, and we'll talk about that later on. And then our diencephalon, of course, is made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay? The brainstem, of course, midbrain, pons, and medulla. Okay? And we'll talk about that. And the brainstem is actually the most critical of the parts of the brain. Okay? Because the brainstem pretty much, if you have a small damage to the brainstem, you could actually die. It could be fatal. But you could hurt large chunks of the cerebrum and still survive. Right? Most of the time I talk about the congresswoman from Arizona who was shot, Congressman Gabby Giffords. She was shot in the head. And it went through the cerebrum. And she lived. Right? And she was conscious when she went to the hospital. Okay. One of the things about the brain is that it doesn't have pain receptors, so you don't feel pain either. Okay. But you know, she had to relearn doing certain things. Okay, because the brain is plastic a little bit because it's got all these neurons in there, and they can connect in other ways. But then you have to relearn and reteach some of those neurons to do those functions. But if you nick a small part of the brainstem, and you will see by the functions that the brainstem performs that it could be fatal, because it controls things like breathing rate, you know, blood pressure, you know, and so forth, and heart rate. So if you're not breathing properly, then you get problems. So these are the parts of it, all right? And of course, it connects the spinal cord to the upper parts of the brain, the cerebrum and cerebellum, right? And you know what? The last part of this class, we'll be talking about the cranial nerves and their functions. I think that's the last, maybe the lecture 20 or 19, or the next one. 10 of those cranial nerves arise from the brainstem, okay? Except 2. The 2 will be the olfactory for smell, which is on the frontal cortex, on the frontal lobe. Okay, and you know, the optic for vision, the number 2. Here you go, the cranial nerve number 2. Okay, the rest of them, 10 of them, okay, arise from the brainstem, scattered throughout. You know what I'm saying? So that's the brainstem right there. It's got all the cranial nerves except just the 2. And like I was saying earlier on, the brainstem is very critical, and you will see very soon by the functions of that it performs. That a small part of it could be fatal. You could die from it. But you could injure chunks of the cerebrum or cerebellum and be still fine and live through it. Okay? So the brainstem is the most critical part. Okay? And that's that right there. We've seen it a few times now, and it's nicely highlighted the brainstem. And here it just shows that the brainstem, like I say, the midbrain, the last part of the brainstem, on top of it will be the diencephalon, the thalamus and the hypothalamus and so forth and so on. Okay, so this is what it's showing. Okay, and these are those cranial nerves I was talking about that arise from the brainstem, 10 of them, all right, except, you know, in the sense of smell, olfactory, and the optic. Okay, all right, so there you go. So again, we will do each one in turn, talk about its parts, and then we go to the next part of the brain and split it up again and talk about it. So the medulla is one we said is continuous with the spinal cord. So the brain will taper down, and when it becomes narrow, then it's spinal cord, and the brain ends right there. So you can see what it's doing right now. Breathing rate, it controls the vasomotor center, which controls the blood vessels. The vasomotor center controls the smooth muscles in the blood vessels, so that when they're relaxed, then the blood vessels are larger diameter, and therefore the pressure is lower. When you lose blood, normally you start to constrict your blood vessels to maintain the pressure, so that you can send all the blood to the extremities. Okay, the vasomotor center is right there in the medulla, right? There are other non-critical functions, of course, like swallowing, vomiting, and coughing, and sneezing, and hiccuping, that are not, critical. But you can see the heart rate, and of course the blood vessels, the breathing, is all critical. Okay, because if you stop breathing in, taking in oxygen, you will soon die. You will suffocate, because then it's not being regulated by the medulla oblongata. Okay, and also these same critical functions. There's another, brainstem part, the pons, which takes care of those things again. And then it things like regulates like depth of breathing and things like that, whereas the rate of breathing and things like that is taken care of by the medulla. Okay, so that's why it's critical. And then of course balance and coordination. Okay, in the exam I might be specific about a certain part and say, okay, tell me some of the functions of the medulla. And if I'm being kind, I can just say the brainstem functions, then you can pick any you like. But I want you to know each part of each of these major parts of the brain. Okay, what each part does, like the medulla, and most of the things it takes care of, the pons, and most of the things it takes care of. Okay, so at the bottom of the medulla is a kind of triangular, looking like tracts or tracts. Tracts at the bottom of it. So the medulla tapers into the spinal cord, right? So you have tracts coming from the upper parts of the brain, and they go like that, and the tracts coming up. So they create this kind of sort of inverted pyramid, the tracts going up and down from the brain into the brain, and that is decusate. Okay, decusate is just a fancy term that means to cross. Okay, so which means the right part of the brain controls the left part of the body. Okay, and then the left part of the body controls the right part of the body. Okay, so if I was to injure my right lobe, I will affect function in my left. If I was to injure my left lobe, okay, then you get the deal. I will affect the other side. So in most cases, the left hemisphere is the dominant one. Why? Because it controls the right side. Even in left-handed individuals, most of them, over 60% of them, still the left is dominant. Okay, because of that deal, and that's because of the decusation that happens at the pyramids, right there in the medulla oblongata. The tracts will cross, so the body will control the contralateral end, opposite side of the brain. So that's the pyramids right there. Okay, it controls motor activity. So there is the medulla oblongata. All right, again, and we move on to the pons. The pons is again the bridge. Did you see what I was saying? What is the pons doing? Pons, pontis, means bridge in Latin. So, pontine nuclei, these are certain groups of neurons or cell bodies in the central nervous system. We call them nuclei. Remember that? Okay, so these regulate breathing. So the depth of breathing is kind of controlled here, right? The depth and so forth. And then the other one is controlling the rate in the medulla. Okay? Guys. And then swallowing, okay? Some of the also balancing chewing and salivation. Have you noticed when you're chewing, how you always conveniently miss chewing your tongue? Unless if you're talking and doing fast eating, it's controlled by that. So that your tongue is always positioned properly, and when you chew, because it's a cyclical thing, and you're chewing, and you control that by the pontine nuclei. Because otherwise you'll be chewing all over your tongue. You do it a few times though. If you beaten your tongue when you're eating, because you're trying to be fast or you're talking or something. But for the most part, you never chew up your tongue because that activity is really controlled, well controlled by the pontine nucleus. Okay? And then, of course, salivation. But the critical functions, of course, is the brain, is the breathing and the heart rate and the blood vessels, the blood pressure. Okay, so there's the pons, it's right in the middle. You see that bulge right there with an MRI, an actual MRI of it, right? Next. So far we've talked about the brainstem, and we've talked mostly about the breathing, the blood pressure, and heart rate. Okay? The vasomotor center and the cardiac center, cardiovascular center is located in the medulla oblongata. Okay? Okay, so now the midbrain is pretty much made up of 4 structures, okay, that look like sort of a heel, if you will. Colliculi means the colliculus is a heel. Okay, so you have 2 colliculi on the top called superior colliculi. Okay, that deal with vision. Okay, so this is vision. Okay, on the top vision, and then you have 2 inferior colliculi that will control hearing. Okay, and those are parts or nuclei of the midbrain. Okay, we're still talking brainstem. Okay, and those 2 superior colliculi, 2 inferior colliculi form 4 bodies, which is what we call the corpora quadragemina. Because corpora is body, and you know what quadragemina means? 4 bodies, 4 geminal centers. Okay, so those 4 bodies will be those 2 inferior colliculi for hearing and the superior colliculi for eyesight. Okay, so if I say in the exam what is the function of the inferior colliculi and the superior colliculi, then you say superior is for sight, reflexes, and so forth, and the inferior colliculi will be for hearing. Okay, and it's only the midbrain. Okay, okay. In the the midbrain, there is also other nuclei that are named after the color they look. Okay, based on what it metabolizes. Like for instance, there is another nuclei called the substantia nigra. Literally means black substance. Okay, substantia is black, is substance, and nigra, of course, is black. What? I was thinking of the G sound, and then I wrote a G. It's a black substance. Why? Because this part of the midbrain, metabolizes dopamine. Okay, and when in the metabolism of dopamine, it creates these what are called oxygen radicals or free radicals that are very reactive species of molecules that will attack brain tissue or any tissue for that matter. So there's a bunch of melanin. Remember, melanin protects against UV light and all these things. So because of the metabolism of dopamine, which is involved in motor activity, right? There's a bunch of melanin which makes it black. So that's why it's called the substantia nigra. Okay, and it deals with, it regulates motor activity. Okay, in fact, it's one of the ones that cancels, like in Parkinson's disease, some of these basal nuclei are involved. It cancels unnecessary motor activity, which is what causes the tremors and whatnot. Okay, because these nuclei cancel out all that unnecessary motor activity. Okay, so the other one, which is also colored, named after the color of it, is the red nucleus. And you can imagine what this is. It's got a lot of blood vessels in it, so it appears pink. So it's called red. Okay, lots of blood vessels. Again, it's involved in motor control. Okay, so it regulates body movements. Okay, then you see that bulge that I was talking about of the pons. It's basically those tracts that connect to the upper parts of the brain called cerebral peduncle. So we're going to dissect the brain, like I said, the next time in AMP2, and we'll see all these structures. Okay? So that's that. So the midbrain, you know what it's doing. Okay, so the life-threatening critical functions are really taken care of by the medulla and the pons. Okay? And then this one also does important, but it's not as life-threatening as other two. Okay, so that's why if you nick a small part of the brainstem, you could be a goner, but you could get injured, big chunks of the cerebrum, and you still be okay. You might have to relearn a few things, but you will leave. Okay, so there's the midbrain right there, and you can check out this MRI. So if I was to take a cross section, right on the top part, on the superior aspect of the brain, the midbrain, just before we get into the diencephalon up here, we can see the red nucleus, which is these 2 guys that look like eyes. Those will be appearing pink if you were to do a cross section to that. So that's the red nucleus. And then, of course, the substantia nigra, see this is the black black and orange. Remember that movie thing? It just reminded me of that. But this is the substantia nigra, and it's got lots of melanin because of the dopamine metabolites that are very reactive and can damage the tissue. So substantia nigra. And this is just the cerebral aqueduct where you have cerebrospinal fluid, and it connects to the fourth ventricle, the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And we will see all that when we do brain structure. I mean, we intersect through the brain next term. And then you can see the superior collicular here that deal with the sight. Okay, you don't see the inferior collicular. Why? Because they're on the bottom. So the plane is going up here, and then the inferior collicular will be down there. So the plane doesn't cut through it. You see what I'm saying? That's why it's not that the inferior collicular is missing here. It's not there because it's just that you cut through the top part, and the bottom one you don't see, but it's there. The one for hearing, the inferior collicular, we have the tubes and things like that. And then these are the pedicles, the cerebral pedicles, which are tracts that connect the lower parts of the brain to the upper parts, right? Like the cerebellum and the cerebrum. Okay, very good. So we're not done with the brainstem. You see how the small things, dynamite comes in small packages. So it's taking care of a lot of functions here. And scattered throughout the brainstem will be what is called the reticular formation. So we got the brainstem like that. Okay. So there will be like sort of nuclei, parts. It connects the whole part like that, called the reticular formation. Okay. And within this reticular formation will be the reticular activating system. So, like when you wake up in the morning, do you wake up alert? No, you are groggy at first. That's because the reticular activating system is waking up your cerebrum. It's arousing it into a state of wakefulness. So it takes a while for you to have all your full faculties together, because this has to do its job. So when you wake up kind of feeling all groggy and whatnot, especially if you didn't have enough sleep, like I've been doing lately. It takes time for it to really wake you up properly. So this is what it's doing, and those are scattered throughout the brainstem, throughout. Okay. So other than that, the reticular formation kind of regulates, cyclic activities like walking and things like that, chewing, breathing, things that go in a cyclical nature. Okay. So they are also controlled, cyclic motor functions are controlled by the reticular formation. And it's still part of the brainstem. Okay? Kind of makes sense because we've been talking a lot about how chewing is taken care of in the pons, in the midbrain, and so this reticular system kind of sort of activates, connects all these parts and does that, and then it so it is also involved in sleep-wake cycles because of that, because it wakes up the cerebrum, it activates it. So cerebellum, like I said, it literally means little brain. Cerebellum means little brain because it is structured just like the cerebrum, with the cerebral cortex on the top, okay, and in the middle. So what happens is that the cerebellar cortex in this case, okay, is the same. You have your neurons, cell bodies. Remember, the neuron cell bodies do not get myelinated, right? So they form the gray matter of the brain. So the cerebellum and the cerebrum, they both have a cortex, and that cortex will have all the neuron cell bodies, okay? And then the neuron cell bodies have axons, and then those are the axons that are myelinated, forming the white matter on the inside. See what I'm saying? So you got all those cell bodies, and then you know what I'm saying? So that's what creates these two layers, okay? And it's more apparent, we'll talk about it again when we talk about the cerebrum. Okay, so that's what happens. And the way those tracts are arranged, if you cut through the cerebellum, it looks like a tree. That's why it's called the arbor-vitae kind of arrangement. Arbor from arboretum, tree, you know what I'm saying? So this is like a leaf, tree-like, okay, with like a trunk. And I'll show you a cross-section of the cerebellum, and you'll see what I mean. Tree trunk kind of appearing with leaves. Okay, so that's why it's called the arbor-vitae, the white matter. That's how those tracts are arranged. Right? And of course, they connect the cerebellum to the rest of the CNS, like the cerebrum and other parts of the stem. Okay, so it connects the cerebral cortex and the cerebral nuclei. The nuclei will be those groups of cell bodies in the cortex where it's gray matter. So the cortex is gray matter, and then the white matter, it's like these white matter dark cells. Right? We all know about that, right? Gray matter and white matter, we did it before. So again, it's split into parts, and the first part is kind of usually tells you what it's doing, like the floccular nodular. If you don't think about eyes, when you hear ocular, it's to do with the eyes. So floccular nodular is got to do with somehow with the eyes. So it's balancing eyes. Have you noticed that it's easier to balance when your eyes are open? Have you tried balancing when your eyes are closed? It's like you can't. It's not you can't, but it's harder. Just because eyes take part in the balance. And also the hearing, the ears take part in balance. And we'll do that in the end too. Okay? But and balance also requires the eyesight to balance properly. Okay? So this is the part of the cerebellum, the floccular nodular, that deals with balance and eye movements. Okay? Ocular to do with the eyes. The vermis, the one I was talking about, which connects the cerebellar hemispheres, okay, is so called because it looks like a worm. You know, vermin is worms. Vermin, have you ever seen that? So vermis, it looks like a worm, so that's why it's kind of called the. So if you look at the cerebellum, it's like that, and then it's got this, and then it's got that. So this part here looks like that. So it looks like a little worm. So this is cerebellar hemisphere, and it connects the lateral hemispheres. It's the connector between these two. Right? So it controls posture. Actually, the cerebellum is involved in all this fine motor activity. Things like when you dance, things like when you learn to ride a bike, all those things are controlled by the cerebellum. Okay? And so that's what it controls, fine motor activity. Okay? And all that stuff. So those guys who compete with So You Think You Can Dance, their cerebellum is really hooked up, right? Because that's how they can dance. Because that's what you learn to complex movements, practicing and things like that. Sort of things of a repetitive nature with a complex pattern to them. That's the natural hemispheres. Right? And the vermis controls fine motor activity, very fine motor activity, and locomotion and posture. Okay. So, but basically, when you think cerebellum, think of all the complex movements that you do, like dancing. Learning to ride a bike is another one that is controlled by the cerebellum. So there's the cerebellum on the back there with your ice cream cone there, and your cerebrum on top. Okay. Okay, there it is, and this is the vermis I was talking about. You see this part that connects the cerebellar hemispheres, right? And then you see the arbovitae nature. You see, it looks like a tree, looks like a leaf, like a spinach leaf, doesn't it? Yeah, it does look like spinach. You like spinach? Yeah. There it is. That's the arbovitae, arbo, tree, and vitae form. So now we go to the diencephalon. The two main parts of the diencephalon we said are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. But then again, surrounding them are these structures like, the thalamus is a circular nuclei, and then the subthalamus is another nucleus that is part of the diencephalon, but it's right immediately underneath. So this will be the subthalamus, right? And then more underneath it will be the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary is on the bottom like that. And then the hypothalamus secretes hormones that control the pituitary gland, right? So everything is kind of centered around the thalamus. And we said the thalamus is the one that triages, okay? In the morning I was saying, if you go to the hospital, there's what they call a triage nurse, okay? He separates the sickest patients go on one side, and the ones that are maybe just coughing and stuff on the other side. So they can do what? They tend to the sickest patients. Because you wouldn't want somebody right there dying of a heart attack while you're attending to somebody with a cough. That would be dying. That's a big sweep. So the same thing with the thalamus, it will do the same thing. It will treat, because you get all sorts of sensory information going to the brain, Okay, so the brain has said, oh, you can deal with this later, but this is critical. We need to deal with it. Not only that, it will send it to the proper part of the brain that takes care of that particular sense. Okay, so it will direct the information. So that's why I was saying all the information that goes to the brain, all sensory information passes through the thalamus. Okay, and except the sense of smell. All right. Okay. Back in the day, there was actually a girl. She's young. She was in her 20s. She went out drinking with her buddies, and she took all sorts of stuff, Valium and whatnot. And then she went into a coma. She passed out. And then she went to the hospital. And she was like a cabbage for a long time. And her dad, I guess she was the caretaker of her, was fighting the hospital to remove her off life support. But then they'd never seen such a case. And then people, you know, the authorities said, no, we can't do that because we never know what's really wrong. She could just wake up. Okay, so eventually she died of sepsis. She was just a cabbage for all that time. And then they did an autopsy. Okay, and they found that this guy was damaged. Okay, so whenever somebody is in a vegetative state nowadays, they check the thalamus to see the state of it, so they can give the family advice that, you know what, you're probably not going to wake up from this, or maybe there's a chance. Okay, so depending on the damage to the thalamus. So that's how critical the thalamus is. Her name was Karen Quinlan. It's just not in this book, but you Google her and it will tell you about it. In that case, set the precedent about how you deal with people in a vegetative state. It was discovered then. So this is very critical. And then, of course, the hypothalamus, we already know about it. It functions with controlling mostly the endocrine system. And we'll talk about a bunch of functions that it does. Okay? The hypothalamus does. Okay? So again, we'll start with the first part. You know, in fact, it looks like a yo-yo. It looks like a yo-yo. Did you guys play with a yo-yo? No? Guys. All this day you play with a video game. Like we used to play with the yo-yo back in the day. Okay, so it will have one lobe on one side of the brain, on one hemisphere, and the other lobe. So that's what a yo-yo is. And then the interthalamic adhesion is what controls, and that's where the string is rolled around in a yo-yo. Sort of stuff. So you know, it's like that. You know, except it's kind of shaped like a long nose, but that's pretty much the thing. The structure of the thalamus. Okay, and then the interthalamic adhesion connects the two like that. And then the third ventricle kind of goes in the middle. It's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and, you know, you'll be able to see some of these things when you cut the brain. So it's an integration center, of course, like we said. Pretty much triages all the information that comes through to the central nervous system and directs it to where it needs to go, to the proper part in the brain which takes care of that. Okay? All right? So everything except smell goes through there. Okay? Everything. All the sensory information to the brain except the sense of smell. And you will notice with the sense of smell, it's not very critical. It's nice to smell stuff. But what happens in the morning when you put your cologne and your perfume? What happens? You tell me. What happens when you spray it or whatever you splash it? Yeah, you feel good. And then what happens immediately after that? Yeah, you don't smell it. After you notice, you don't smell yourself the whole day. You only smell it for a little bit. That's because the sense of smell adapts very quickly. Okay, you don't need to be smelling yourself all the time. With all the sensory information that goes to the brain, imagine if you had to be smelling yourself the whole day. You got to concentrate on your math or something, or this physiology part, and you're constantly smelling yourself. It will become annoying after a while. So the sense of smell quickly adapts. 50% is cut off in about a second of the smell. It doesn't mean it's not there, because when you come in the morning or in the afternoon, like now, I can smell you for the first time, and then after a while, if you stay close to me, then I want to smell you. Because it adapts, okay? It's not critical to be smelling it all the time. With all the things that the brain has to take care of, some things it can ignore. Okay? So, interacts, you know, with other parts of the brain, of course, controls motor activity, like I said, directs all the sensory information to the proper part in the brain that takes care of that particular sense. And we'll be talking about different parts of the brain and their functions and whatnot. Okay, so, and of course it's involved in emotions and pain because it receives all the sensory input. So it will, it kind of perceives the sensory input into an emotional response. Okay, so that's what the thalamus does. It's pretty much a control center, a triaging center. And then the subthalamus is right beneath it, and of course it is just inferior to the thalamus. So it also involved in motor function, right? Lots of control of motor function. Whenever something controls is a motor activity, usually it's controlling what? Skeletal muscles, right? That's the motor. When most of the time we refer to motor, except a few that control glands and so on. But for the most part, the motor is doing something, it's controlling the skeletal muscles. And then the epithalamus is above the thalamus. So the thalamus is like that, and it's kind of sort of above and behind, posterior to it, superior and posterior. So you have the pineal body right there, and then the hypothalamus somewhere down there. Okay, so the hypothalamus nuclei, it deals with set emotions that are related to smell. Okay, like for instance, in the bathroom you're doing number 2, the emotional response to that won't be good, right? Because depending on who you are, sometimes it's bad with others. But if I get you a bouquet of roses, the emotional response to that will be very pleasant, right? Because you smell it as well. So that's the hypothalamus nuclei that takes care of that. It generates emotions based on the sense of smell. All right? So you should be able to get that one anytime. And then the pineal body, what it does is that it produces melatonin. I think I talked about this again when we talked about the endocrine system. Remember, I said melatonin is usually a sleep aid, and sleeping pills that contain melatonin. So so that's why the pineal body is kind of involved in the sleep-wake cycles. Okay. But sometimes it plays a role in puberty. Like when you reach puberty, you start secreting all these hormones, androgens, estrogen and testosterone and whatnot, depending on sex, and so you start to do all those sexual development. So sometimes it's involved with that one side controlling those hormones, I guess. Because of the melatonin, it's involved in sleep cycles. So gotta know, each part. The thing about it, the brain, is that it's split into these major 4 parts, but then those parts are split into smaller parts too. So I want you to know those details of, these hypothalamus nuclei, about sense of smell and the response to that, emotional response, and then of course the pineal body, melatonin. Some of these things you've seen them a few times too. You're beginning to kind of get used to it now. It's not all new information on dumpling. Especially when you start talking about the hypothalamus, because we did talk a lot about it when we did and some of it was in the exam too. In fact, how the hypothalamus controls the pituitary, right? So that's some of the information that kind of builds up on itself, and we're not always just dumping new information. Okay, we're just sort of expanding and expanding. So we're still in the diencephalon. So the hypothalamus really deals with all the visceral activities. It is kind of like the autonomic nervous system. Anything that's automatically controlled to do with the digestive system, whether it be hunger, whether it's pleasure, thirst, all those things. Blood pressure, it's all controlled by, because blood pressure, after all, is a result of the amount of blood in the pipes, in the blood vessels, and that is regulated by how much water intake you have. If you're taking enough water, you get enough blood volume, the blood pressure is good. If you lose water or you lose any fluids by any means, then your blood pressure goes down because you don't have the fluids. Okay? So, it's also a center for emotional response and behavior because it deals with all these things like food. That's where your satiety center is. So you feel hungry, it certain behaviors, food seeking. So it does that. Body temperature, it regulates body temperature, it does all those things. Most of the soft internal organs are controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay? And then of course it has that endocrine function which we talked about, because it releases all these hormones, like the growth hormone, releasing hormone, which causes release of growth hormone, and all those things. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary to form, the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, which are gonadotropins. Right? So it controls the endocrine system function. So mammillary bodies in there kind of sort of centers for olfaction, of function is smell. Okay? Alright? So you notice most of the other nuclei around kind of deal with smell, but it doesn't go through the thalamus, like you said. Okay? So sometimes I do say, okay, what are the functions of the hypothalamus? And then you list all these things. Taste control, hunger, water balance, water intake, control of the endocrine system. So there's a lot of stuff. Autonomic control center, any of the soft internal organs are controlled by that. Alright? So therefore it is involved in homeostasis. All those physiological processes that go on in the body, the aim is to maintain a stable internal environment so that things are not deviating too much from the set point. Alright. Isn't that a deal? Very good. So this is the Diencephalon with all these parts. Pineal, thalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, and so forth. And we know about the infundibulum, right? Because the infundibulum is what connects the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. So that's where those tracts that control it, posterior pituitary go through. Okay, and it's right there in the cerebellum. Remember the cerebellum? Pituitary sits in there. When we did the skeletal system, it's that C-shaped part of the floor of the cranium. Alright? Alright, there you go. And this is just showing the different parts of the hypothalamus and what they deal with, from the temperature and all those things, and the hunger center, which is called the satiety center. When you feel hungry, you need food intake, then this is the hypothalamus telling you that maybe you gotta go get a something. Okay? So that's that. And we move on. Cerebrum, which is the last part, where the major part of the brain, really. But the critical function, you see, and all the vital parts, vital functions are taken care of by the brainstem. Okay? But equally, not equally important, but very important functions are also taken care of here. Because pretty much, I would say that the cerebrum is like where the soldiers are located, right? And then the brainstem, that's where the general is, or the colonel, who directs all these soldiers to do stuff. So all the parts that really do the bulk of the work is located in the cerebrum, but it's directed by the brainstem and what to do. Okay? So on a gross structure of the brain, if you ever look at the brain, you see these little squiggles and bumps and so forth. So the bumps on it are called the gyri, okay, and the grooves, the cracks and so forth are called sulcus. Sulcus, gyrus is singular. Gyri, sulci, plural. Okay, these are Latin words again. Okay, so to resist the temptation of calling gyrus the grooves because of the GG. Okay, the gyri are the bumps, which are the ridges, and the sulcus are the grooves. Okay, so it's kind of like opposite. Don't call the grooves gyri. No. Okay, and I'll show you them. You've been seeing those squiggles, and I'll show you a few pictures of it. And then, of course, there's a big crack here that separates the two cerebral hemispheres, called the longitudinal fish. Okay, that's where the sagittal suture runs along as well. Okay. Alright, so there's that crack there right in the middle of the brain that separates the two. Alright, and then we got the lobes. Okay, so the frontal lobe, what does it deal with? Things like judgment, things like aggression. Okay, that's what deals with it. And I'll show it to you again. Working memory as well. Working memory is when when you're doing something, the short-term memory is you're doing something. So it's called working memory. It's all frontal lobe. Okay. So mood is also controlled by the frontal cortex. Actually, what happened back in the day, they were railway workers, and so these guys were blasting rocks. Okay, and so when you drill a hole and you insert dynamite in the wall and then it blows up, but you have to take shelter first. So this guy was knocking the dynamite into the wall, and then boom, it exploded before he could get out of the way. God forbid. And it went through his skull, through the frontal cortex. It impaled him. He was still conscious, by the way, even when he went to the hospital, he was conscious. Again, the brain doesn't have pain receptors when you went to the hospital, they were able to take it out. Okay. At the beginning, he was a very trustworthy guy, always early to work, very good guy, no problem. After the injury, because of what the frontal lobe controls, he was now criminal, late, and he was all doing this deviant behavior, just because of that injury. Okay? So one of the good things about the brain is that such injury to the brain, like as long as it's not on the brainstem, you don't die, and you don't go into shock. When you go into shock is when you have too much pain. The body cannot take care of it, it switches off. But it's a good thing that where all the neurons are located, you don't feel pain. Because if you did, man, it would be really processed really nicely. And besides, it's the control center. You don't want to switch it off because it controls everything else. So it doesn't have pain receptors, and it's good that it doesn't. Okay. So anyway, the parietal lobe, and these are named after the bone under which it occurs. Like the frontal is under the frontal bone, the parietal is under the parietal bone. Okay, so P, pressure, so that's how I gauge what it does. It's pressure, therefore pressure is charged. That's what the parietal lobe does. Temperature as well. Pain. Okay, because sometimes I do say list all the parts of the brain, or the lobes of the brain, of the cerebrum, and what their functions are. One or two functions. And this one, the occipital, under the occipital bone at the back, it deals with vision. And I will repeat this again later on. The temporal lobe kind of deals with, it's right by the ears. So the first thing you want to think when you think temporal is hearing, right? Because of hearing, it deals with memory, things like that, and kind of abstract thought, abstract things are not concrete things. They're kind of sort of fuzzy in between kind of things. So abstract thought and sometimes smell as well. It does that. All right. And then the insula is really also considered a lobe, the fifth lobe, but it's kind of hidden on the lateral sulcus. There's like a groove that goes across like that, and inside of it, so the lateral sulcus kind of goes like that, and then this will be hidden inside. Insula means island, kind of sort of hidden in there, and it's usually involved in taste. Okay, the insula is involved in taste, and it controls some of these visceral functions, to do with the soft internal organs. The insula does, and then whenever anything deals with the visceral organs, the internal, which is soft internal organs, it's part of the autonomic nervous system, because those are automatically controlled. Autonomic nervous system. Okay, so it's involved in that. That's the insula. Okay, so 5 lobes, 5 questions, functions, and name the lobes. That's a good 5 points, right? Okay, so there is the cerebrum. Okay, and this is the crack I was talking about, called the longitudinal feature, right in the middle, divides left and right. These are the olfactory bulbs for the cranial nerve number 1. This for smell. One that doesn't go through the thalamus. Okay, and besides these pictures, I want you to look at it. There's an MRI of an actual human being. You can actually see where it's located, and it's highlighted. So this is what I was talking about. You see, the bumps, the ridges, are called gyri, gyrus singular, right? And then the grooves or the cracks, sulcus, singular. Gyri plural, sulci singular, plural. Okay? So that's the cross structure of the brain. Again, the longitudinal fissure in the middle there, and then you can see the gyri, and this is the temporal lobe. Then the parietal lobe on top, frontal, occipital. And then the insula is kind of hidden in between here, and you will see it in a little bit. Okay, you see this lateral sulcus, which is here. That's where the thing goes inside, because this part of the brain comes like that cerebrum, and then it goes in, and then the temporal lobe, and this is the parietal lobe. The insula is kind of located here, like that, kind of hidden in the crack. The crack is all you see on the outside. Okay. So again, it will show you each of these lobes. You see the frontal lobe, all right, parietal lobe, and then the occipital at the back, and then, like I said, they're just named after the bones under which they occur, right? And then, of course, the temporal, right there on the side, and then this is the external acoustic meters. Remember, we did this already. So, so if I was to ever ask you functions of the temporal lobe, then the first thing you should say is hearing, because that's where the ears are located. Right there. You shouldn't forget that. Okay. And then the parietal pressure tracts, things like that. Right? Okay. Again, like I was saying, the 10 cranial nerves arise from the brainstem. These are them right there. And then this one here, you see, this is cranial nerve number 2. It also crosses like that. Okay, that's what's called the optic chiasma. It's the optic nerve for the eyesight and sense of eyesight. And then this is cranial nerve number 1. These two are the olfactory bulb. And that is the cranial nerve number 1. And those are the ones that don't start or originate from the brainstem. Right? And at the end, we'll talk about cranial nerve function. So you see what I was talking about? This is the lateral sulcus, and then it goes inside, and this is the temporal lobe, parietal lobe up here, and then the insula is over here. And you can take a longitudinal section. Okay, these are the ventricles of the brain, the lateral ventricles of the brain. Good field, and we'll see that later on. And then again, look at these MRIs and really look at the brain structure and see these lobes. You see, this part of the frontal is the prefrontal lobe. Okay? That's one that's really mostly involved in working memory. And then the frontal lobe proper is this. Okay? But all of it is just frontal lobe. But this is the prefrontal lobe. Alright, very good. Still on the cerebrum. Okay, like the frontal lobe. Again, I'm going to give you the functions of each of these. Okay, so that it's really clear. So, any voluntary motor activity, you've got, any motivation, aggression, things like that, mood, also working memory is part of it, especially the prefrontal lobe, okay, working memory. But also sense of smell is involved here. Most of the other parts of, because where are the olfactory lobes located? Right under the frontal lobe. Make sense? Right? Exactly. So, and then the parietal lobe, because we said P is for pressure, so things like touch, temperature, pain, P, pressure, pain, okay? All this touch, all right? And then, of course, taste and balance is also located there, okay? Temperature. In the exam, we want you to know a couple of functions or so for each of these lobes, all right? But some of them are specialized, like the occipital lobes, that's the visual center. Because when you see things, the things are inverted left to right and upside down. It is the occipital lobe in the brain that will put it the right way up. So right now I'm seeing you upside down because of the way the light travels. Okay, the light from your bottom of the object comes and goes to the top, and the light from the top of the object comes down and goes to the bottom. So the object is inverted and it's left to right. It's like a mirror image kind of thing. So this part of the brain will make sense of that and put it the right way up so you can see properly. Okay? And then of course the temporal lobe, number 1 is hearing, of course. And it evaluates smell. Notice how every other part deals with smell, except the thalamus. You see that? Okay, hearing, input, involved in memory as well. Because when you hear things, that's how you remember things. So, and then the abstract thought I was talking about in judgment. Okay? Temporal lobes, and then the insula, of course, is located deep within the lateral fissure, and I talked about how it's involved in taste. Okay, and it's involved in autonomic nervous system functions because it controls all the visceral activities, which is the soft internal organs. All right. So you know the lobes, you know the functions of each. You know the parts of the brainstem, you know the functions of each of those parts. You know the diencephalon, you know each of the functions of the parts of the diencephalon. Okay, the major of which is the thalamus. So good. So the cerebrum is a huge part of the brain, right? and I talked about how you have all these cell bodies located in the cortex, and then those axons, they make sort of certain patterns, okay, that connect the other parts of the brain. So the fibers connecting the same parts in the same hemisphere, whether it be the right or the left, they are association fibers. The projection fibers are the ones that come from the brain and control the lower parts, and they go pass through the medulla oblongata, dissociate like that, cross, and control the other side. So that's projection. And then commissural fibers connect the left and right side. Okay, so there are those three fibers. Within the same hemisphere, association, from one hemisphere to the next, commissural, and then from the brain to the lower parts, projection, because it's projecting to the rest of the body. Okay, in fact, with the commissural fibers, you have what is called the anterior commissure. Okay, and these are some of the parts of the brain that we will do when we dissect through the brain next year. Okay, and it's the minor part. The anterior commissure connects the left and right hemisphere, plus the major connector between the two, the one I mentioned earlier on, is a bunch of commissural fibers, is the corpus callosum. Okay, the corpus callosum is the one I was saying. Literally has over 300 million axons crossing from the left side to the right side. Okay, and those are commissural fibers. They connect the two sides of the brain. Projection goes to the other parts of the brain and the spinal cord and the lower parts. Okay, and these are the ones that decussate in the medulla oblongata. Association within the same lobe, within the same hemisphere. Okay, they connect areas. So sometimes I will say, okay, can you talk about the fibers in the brain and what the function of it is, the connector, the tracts, because once they're in the brain, they're myelinated, they're called tracts. So you get your commissural fibers that connect the two hemispheres. You get your projection fibers that will decussate right here by the pyramids in the medulla oblongata that connect the lower parts of the brain and also other body parts. And then association fibers within each. Some of them are really short, you know what I'm saying? So these ones are kind of going that way, so that's why you see the dots of those fibers. Okay, so commissural fibers connect different parts of the same hemisphere. All right. Do you see the tracts I was talking about? Where you have on the cortex, you have the cortex is about, the cerebral cortex is about 5 millimeters thick, 5 millimeters thick, and that's where about 75% of all the neurons in the nervous system are packed. So those are gray matter, neurons tightly packed. Okay, and then we have the fibers with the axons going down. Do you see that? And that's what forms all those commissural fibers. And then you can see the above-entire arrangement in the cerebellum. Okay. Isn't that nice? Hey, there we go. Move on with the cerebellum. We said nuclei are parts or groups of neurons in the central nervous system that perform a specific function. We said that already. So there are certain nuclei in the cerebellum that are striated. They get striations. It is 2 of them. That's why they're called corpus. Again, is a body, and striatum, it got striations on it, streaks, lines on it. So that's why it's called corpus striatum. It's the group of nuclei located in the cerebrum that are called basal nuclei that deal with motor activity. So, like the ones I was talking about that are involved in Parkinson's disease, those are basal nuclei that deal with motor activity. Okay, so the one of them is called caudate. Caudate is like tail end, so it kind of looks like a tail, kind of looks longish. Okay, that's one of those striated ones called collectively known as the corpus striatum. Okay, and that's in the cerebrum. And then the lentiform one, it looks lens. That's where the name lentiform comes from, and it looks like a lens, that nuclei. So some of these nuclei are named because of the shape of the nucleus. Some of them are named because of the color of the nucleus, right? Like we just talked about the substantia nigra, the red nucleus. Okay, these ones are named after the form. So the lentiform looks like a lens, so that's what it looks like, and those two are striated, and collectively they're called the corpus striatum. Okay, so The subthalamic also nuclei is another nuclei that deals with motor activity. And this one is located where? In the Diencephalon, right? The ones in the cerebrum are the ones that are striated, and they're called corpus striatum, the two of them. Caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. Alright? And then the substantia nigra is located in the midbrain, right? So and it's another nuclei. Remember the substantia nigra, the black substance, is located in the midbrain. So it's part of the brainstem. Okay? So this kind of nuclei are spread out like that, and they deal with motor activity, right? And they control motor activity. Okay? And I'll show you the three main basal nuclei that are involved in Parkinson's disease in the next few slides. So they're important in controlling motor functions. Usually they cancel out unnecessary motor activity so that to prevent tremors, shakes, and things like that. Okay? So it's the inhibitory function of dopamine that is working with. That's why the substantia nigra, metabolizes a bunch of dopamine, but the end product is those reactive oxygen species, or those reactive species free radicals that can attack the brain. Hence, it's got melanin in it to protect it. Okay, so these are the basal nuclei that I said are involved in Parkinson's disease. Okay. The caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. Okay? Again, they deal with this motor activity and they control unnecessary motor activity. So those are the locations of them. Okay? Those basal nuclei. Alright, so moving on with the cerebrum. The last part of this is a system that connects all these parts of the cerebrum, goes all over the place, and it's called the limbic system. You know, a system is a group of organs, that have a specific function. So the biggest function of the limbic system is emotional response, because it connects all these parts that receive different sensory information, okay, from all these parts, okay? Because what parts are involved? You see, it's got the cerebral cortex, it's got the basal nuclei, the thalamus is also connected, and pretty much all the senses go through the thalamus except smell. The hypothalamus with all the stuff that it controls, like hunger, thirst, blood pressure, all this visceral activity. The olfactory cortex for smell, deals with smell. So all that, when you put it all together and you connect it, it forms a system called the limbic system, and therefore things like memory, because where do you get your memory? From your sensory experiences. Okay? Like when you put things into memory when you're studying, you're reading it, sense, or sometimes you're hearing it, hearing, sight, all those senses. All that sensory information goes up there, is processed by all these nuclei and parts of the brain, and that's how you generate your memory, and it also controls reproduction, because like the hypothalamus deals with all these reproductive hormones, like this is gonadotropin releasing hormones, and so forth. LH and FSH cause formation of the egg cell, formation of the sperms, release of testosterone, all that reproductive function. And then of course nutrition, because it deals with the hunger center. When you're hungry, you need to eat nutrients, you put in nutrients through that. But the biggest function of the limbic system is emotions. It generates emotions based on all the sensory input it receives. Right? After interpretation of all that sensory information. So that's the limbic system right there. So if I ask about the functions of that, we know to first talk about emotional response through all this sensory information that goes to all the parts that are involved in the limbic system. Okay? And that's it. Thank you guys, I appreciate it. We shall see you in a small while. Okay?